Migrating from previous Exchange versions to Exchange 2010. Congratulations! At this point, you should have learned everything you need to know to be successful with migrating your existing Exchange organization to Exchange 2010. We've talked about mailbox servers, we've talked about hub transport servers, we talked about edge transport servers, we've talked about all the different pieces that you need to put into place to have a fully functioning Exchange 2010 infrastructure. So you'll find that in this nugget there's really, there's not any demo left to do. Because at this point you've really understood all of the different configuring pieces that you need to do to set up that Exchange 2010 infrastructure. Now there are a couple of pieces, however, that you probably want to be aware of whenever you're making this change. I think I'll argue that most of us at this point are probably not going to be spending too many times actually creating brand new Exchange 2010 organizations. A lot of us have an existing mail system already. A lot of us have an existing mail system that's on Exchange 2003 or Exchange 2007. Even a few might even be on Exchange 5.5. And so what you really need to know are what are the steps in order that you need to go through to be successful in converting your old Exchange to Exchange 2010. Now a couple of things before we actually get into those steps. Number one is to recall that Exchange 2010 is unlike all of the other previous versions of Exchange in that it leverages your Active Directory site structure for its routing. This means that any migration from a previous version of Exchange requires first a look at your AD site structure. If your site structure isn't correctly defined, or if it's not defined in the way that you want your mail routing to be defined, well then you can't really start that Exchange migration until after you've completed an Active Directory restructure. Now luckily Active Directory sites are fairly easy to restructure. All you really need to do is make the changes and watch them propagate throughout your Active Directory. But you have to be aware of that AD site structure and really get that to the point where you want it before you start that Exchange 2010 migration. Also remember that storage groups and routing groups and administrative groups no longer exist in Exchange 2010. So all of that separation between Exchange and Active Directory is really no longer there. So when you're going through that Exchange migration and preparing for it, be aware that you're going to have to wrap all of those administrative pieces into your Active Directory. One other piece that you have to be conscious of is the fact that Exchange 2010 does require a 64-bit version of the operating system. This means that if your servers and your operating systems aren't at x64, well, you're going to need to spend a little bit of money to get them to x64 before you start that process. Because if you don't have x64, well, Exchange just simply isn't going to work. One more piece. If you are one of those rare organizations that's still at Exchange 5.5, before you actually migrate to Exchange 2010, you must complete a transition first to Exchange 2003. Once you go through that first step, then you can make the move to 2010, but you have to make that jump first because there is no direct migration path between Exchange 5.5 and Exchange 2010. Now with these pieces in mind, let's actually take a look at the full list of steps that you need to be aware of when you're making that jump from Exchange Server 2003 to 2010, or if you're jumping from 2007 to 2010. Let's go ahead and scroll down here to my list of steps that you have to be aware of. You'll see here that I've got a list of more or less the high-level things you need to be aware of when you're making that migration from Exchange 2003 to Exchange 2010. Step one is to ensure that your existing Exchange 2003 organization is indeed in native mode. It needs to be in native mode to actually complete the migration. And also that your Exchange servers are at Exchange Server 2003 SP2. This version of the Exchange server is needed to actually allow for that mailbox migration. You also need to ensure that your Active Directory forests and domains are at Windows Server 2003 for their functional level, both the forest functional level and the domain functional level. It's acceptable to be at a higher functional level like 2008 or 2008 R2, but minimally you do need to be at Windows Server 2003. Now most of us these days probably have our domain controllers at least Windows Server 2003 SP2. But you do have to have at least one of those domain controllers per site to be at that version. So be aware of what your versions are for your Exchange and domain controllers. Once you've done that, you can start by creating a Windows Server 2008 x64 server and install all the necessary LDIF-DE tools so that you can do that schema migration. Also, make sure you install those Exchange 2010 prerequisites. We talked about what those prerequisites are, and depending on whether you're using Windows 2008 RTM or R2, those prerequisites will obviously be a little bit different, because R2 includes some of those prerequisites with the operating system. Once you've got that server ready to go, run setup and upgrade your Active Directory schema. Now, this is the part that may be somewhat challenging for you. That schema update process, although usually is a technically easy process, can sometimes be a politically challenging process. So it's recommended that you go through the schema update process with a copy of your existing schema. Synchronize the domain controller, pull it offline, and test it against that domain controller first. Also, make sure that the setup process prepares both the forest and the domains when it's going through that schema update process. Now remember that the setup process, if left to its own devices, will do all of this through the single setup command. You do have to disable the link state protocol when you're going about doing this coexistence period between Exchange 2003 and Exchange 2010. And the reason for that is because the link state protocol handles the updates of that link state between your Active Directory sites and your routing groups. And so disable link state as you're in this period of coexistence. The next thing you want to do is install those client access servers per your 2010 site design. Go ahead and migrate Outlook Web App, Active Sync, and Outlook Anywhere to your Exchange 2010 client access servers. This may involve a little bit of downtime, but if you do a parallel instance, you should probably be able to migrate that information over with relatively little downtime to your users. The next step is to install those hub transport servers, again per your 2010 site design, and migrate your mail traffic to those hub transport servers. Hub transport servers at 2010 will be able to route mail to Exchange 2003, so this is an important step before you go into the next step, which is installing those mailbox servers and configuring your database availability groups. This is an important process and one that can actually take a fairly extended period of time. In this part of the migration, Exchange 2010 and Exchange 2003 will be more or less operating in coexistence mode. This means that the mailbox server move process will start from Exchange 2010. If you go to your E2010 server and tell it to pull the mailbox from 03 to 010, it should complete that process successfully. Now be aware that moving those mailbox servers can take a pretty decent period of time, and it linearly scales with the number of mailbox servers and the number of mailboxes that you have. So be conscious of the amount of time it takes to make that migration from 03 to 2010. This could take a while. The next step is to create your public folder replicas, and then also finally migrate those mailboxes to Exchange 2010, to your mailbox servers. Once you've done that, you can migrate the offline address book generation server to your Exchange 2010 mailbox server. You can complete the migration of the public folder hierarchy, and then also those public folder replicas to your Exchange 2010 mailbox servers and or public folder servers. This really completes the data migration, and at this point you can go through deleting the public and private information stores from your Exchange 2003 servers. Now here's the important part that a lot of people neglect when they're going through their migration process. It is exceptionally important that you go through deleting those information stores once they're empty, and also deleting the routing group connectors and the recipient update service agreements using ADSI Edit. Lastly, it's important for you also to uninstall all of those Exchange 2003 servers. The uninstallation process is critical because this uninstallation process goes through the Active Directory data removal process so that all of that orphan data from Exchange 2003 gets pulled out of the Active Directory structure. You'll want to make sure you do this so you don't end up with that data residing in your Active Directory from now on. This process for Exchange 2003 to Exchange 2010 is, relatively similar to the process you'll go through for Exchange 2007 to 2010. You'll notice here that the steps are just a little bit shorter because there are a little bit fewer steps that you have to do from making this single jump from 07 to 10. Obviously, you're going to need to always make sure that your Exchange servers are at Exchange Server 2007 SP2. And as before, you need to ensure that Active Directory forest and domains are at the Windows Server 2003 functional level or higher. Ensure that those domain controllers, at least one per site, is at Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 2. Exchange 2003 and 2007 are similar in the fact that they have those separate routing groups. So at this step in the process, also make sure that your site structure is correctly provisioned so that it's ready for Exchange 2010 routing. You'll want to make sure that's the case before you start the third step here, which is actually creating your first Windows Server 2008 x64 server. Just like before, you're going to need to install those Exchange 2010 prerequisites. Run the setup, upgrade the schema, and prepare both the forest and domains. Just like with 03, you will need to disable that link state protocol. And start by installing those client access servers per your 2010 site design. You'll want to migrate Outlook Web App, ActiveSync, and Outlook Anywhere to those E2010 client access servers. Install your hub transport servers and migrate the mail traffic there. Install the mailbox servers, configure your DAGs, create the public folder replicas, migrate your mailboxes, the offline address book generation server, your public folder replicas, and then eventually you'll finally be done. Just like with the Exchange 2003 migration, really the largest part of this is the process to migrate those mailboxes and the mailbox servers, because they have the largest content of data that you have to be conscious of. In either of these migration processes, you're going to have to be aware of also the policies that you want to create and those that you want to migrate from the old server infrastructure to the new server infrastructure. If you have mail policies, or if you have anti-spam tools, or if you have content filtering tools that are in your old infrastructure, whether they're third-party or from Microsoft itself, be conscious of those and make sure that you have prepared appropriately to have the right versions for Exchange 2010. Once you've completed the entire migration process, just like with the Exchange 2003 process, you'll want to delete that public and private information store and eventually uninstall all of your Exchange 2007 servers. This completes all the steps that you need to do, at least at a very high level. Now, as I said before, you know all of these steps. You've actually performed these steps through the previous nuggets in this series. So there's really nothing additional to show you in terms of completing this migration from a previous Exchange version to Exchange 2010. In this nugget, we've really talked about what those high-level steps are, and we've given you the project plan that you need in order to be successful with your migration process. We've talked about how you need to recall that your Exchange 2010 leverages your Active Directory site structure for routing. You need to be aware about those storage groups, routing groups, and administrative groups that no longer exist. You need to recall that Exchange 2010 requires x64, and also that you're going to have to make 2 hops if you want to jump from E55 to Exchange 2010. Lastly, we went through those steps to get you prepared for your project. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.